This is the Great Man-Made River, and it's called the world's largest irrigation project, and the Libyan government even declared the river the eighth wonder of the world. The project was the dream of former President Gaddafi. He wanted to make the Libyan desert as green as the flag of the Libyan Jamahiriya. That's what Libya was called during his reign. Did they manage to make the desert green? How was the construction done, and what did it lead to? I'll make myself some coffee and tell you. Just an unobtrusive reminder to hit the like button if you happen to forget at the end of the video. And thanks to those who understand my wish to stay anonymous. Let's start by looking at the initial data. Libya is a coastal country with its entire northern border along the Mediterranean Sea. It's easy to see the problem just by looking at the country's location. The Sahara covers about 90% of Libya's territory, and half of that is sand desert. So it's basically an ocean of sand. Another issue, which is partly related to the first one, is the lack of permanent rivers in Libya. Numerous wadis, that's what they call dry riverbeds in Arab countries, fill up with floodwaters during rainstorms, but then they quickly dry out or become low in water. Given these conditions, it's no surprise that Libya is known as one of the driest countries in the world, and only a narrow coastal region, which is less than 5% of the country's area, receives more than 4 inches of rain annually. In the rest of the country, rain in Libya is almost non-existent. It falls at the end of winter and the start of spring in short, heavy showers. A few minutes and that's it. Naturally, the majority of the population lives in the coastal cities where there's at least some rainfall. According to open data from 2020, 78.2% of Libyans lived in urban areas. That's 5.38 million people out of a total population of 6.8 million. Of course, there are people living in rural areas. Most of them live in oases along the coast and engage in irrigation farming. Their plots of land are usually small and privately owned, and of course ensuring they get enough water can be tricky. The Middle East and North Africa are well known for their severe water shortages. The lack of water in the region is a result of many factors, including the harsh climate, extreme heat, high evaporation rates, and the constant population growth. Libya is no exception. According to the World Resources Institute, it ranks 6th among countries facing an extremely high baseline water stress. In the 1960s, the country started working on desalination, which means extracting salt from seawater to make it drinkable, but it didn't get much attention. This was because in 1969, the Gaddafi regime came to power, and the focus shifted to the Great Man-Made River project. It was supposed to solve all of the country's water problems at once. The water shortage in Libya actually began in the 1930s when the country was under Italian occupation, but besides water, there was neither money nor other resources to do anything about it. Then everything changed, almost overnight, when oil companies started drilling wells. They were looking for oil, but in 1953, drilling in the deserts of southern Libya unexpectedly led to the discovery not only of large oil reserves, but also fresh water trapped in aquifers. It was like finding 2 treasures instead of 1. Subsequent analysis showed that the discovered water is part of the Nubian Aquifer, a massive reservoir of fossil water that's between 10,000 and 1 million years old. The water seeped into the sandstone before the end of the last ice age, when the climate in the Sahara region was mild and stayed trapped underground. Then the surface dried up and everything got buried in sand. It's now known that the Nubian Aquifer, located under the eastern part of the Sahara Desert, spans the political borders of Libya, Chad, Sudan, and Egypt. It covers an area of just over 770,000 square miles and contains an estimated 39 quadrillion gallons of groundwater. Is that a lot? Of course it is. When the water was discovered, the Libyan government planned to organize large-scale agricultural projects right in the desert. Yes, right there on the spot. But then, in the early 1980s, plans changed. That's when other projects were prepared. This time, a massive pipeline network to the coast. They said it was much better than desalination, which involves huge economic costs, including maintenance expenses. There was neither the technology nor the infrastructure. Although most of Libya's water supply used to come from expensive desalination plants on the coast, not much water was available for irrigating the land. Moreover, the coastal aquifer historically used in Tripoli, the capital of Libya, was becoming polluted and its salinity was increasing. And then this huge gift, massive volumes of water. The only catch was that no one lived where it was discovered. meaning they had to make the water flow in the right direction. That's how the idea of the Great Man-Made River came about. Essentially, it's not a river in the traditional sense, but a network of underground pipelines and aqueducts through which fresh water from ancient underground aquifers deep in the Sahara flows to the coast of Libya. But it only sounds simple. In reality, creating the river required some serious work. First of all, it's important to say that the construction was divided into several phases, meaning it's not just one continuous pipe, but many in different parts of the country. The plan was to drill wells to a depth of hundreds of feet underground to reach the water. Then these wells were supposed to be connected to the coastline by a network of pipelines stretching 2,500 miles. The pipelines were expected to supply more than 1.6 billion gallons of water a day. And so, in the mid-1980s, Gaddafi announced the start of the first phase and laid the first stone of the project in the Sahara aquifer in eastern Libya. Today, water comes from 13,000 wells, 1,600 feet deep, drilled in the desert, spaced miles apart. 13-foot-wide pipes made of reinforced concrete stretch for over 1,700 miles. After that, the water is collected in at least 10 open and underground reservoirs before being pumped into local networks in cities, towns, and nearby farmlands. Omar Mukhtar and Al Gardabia are the two main reservoirs and, as often happens, have become tourist attractions. In terms of priority, water from the man-made river is primarily intended for agricultural use, then for domestic purposes, and finally for industry. But let's take a closer look at how it's produced. In 1983, the Great Man-Made River Authority, established by the government specifically to manage the project, signed a contract to build the first arm known as GMR-1 or Phase 1. They were planning to build it at two fields, Tazirbu and Sarir. The first hundreds of water wells were drilled at that time, with water being pumped from a depth of about 1,600 feet. Water from both fields was pumped underground through a double pipeline into a reservoir in Ajdabia. Water first arrived there in 1989. From there, it was diverted in two directions, west to the coastal city of Sirte and north to Benghazi. The completion of the first phase was officially celebrated in Benghazi in 1991. It was estimated that GMR-1 could transport 528 million gallons of water per day through a double pipeline stretching about 990 miles. A total of 250,000 pipe sections were laid during the first phase. At that time, they were considered the largest in the world. Each had a diameter of 13 feet and a length of 23 feet. Made at two large factories in Libya, the pipe sections were made up of layers of pre-stressed concrete reinforced with steel. The sections were laid into trenches 23 feet deep by specially built cranes and shoved into place by bulldozers. Then the joints were sealed with giant rubber O-rings and cement grout, and the trench areas were filled in. Open reservoirs located at distribution hubs like Ajdabia are artificial lakes dug into the soil and rock covered with asphalt. The largest reservoir, over 3,300 feet in diameter, holds 6.3 billion gallons of water. It's massive. According to estimates from the Great Man-Made River Authority, it took about 5 million tons of cement to make the pipes, and the raw materials used would be enough to build 20 Great Pyramids of Giza. The authority also says that the steel wire used in the pipe production is long enough to circle the Earth 280 times. To understand the scale, you can look at this monument made from a section of pipe from the Great Man-Made River. Essentially, it's just a section of pipe. The river's made from the same ones. But let's get back to how the project came to life. The second system, GMR-2 or Phase 2, located in the west of Libya, began supplying drinking water to the country's capital, Tripoli, in 1996. GMR-2 draws water from three sources in the Jabal al-Hasawina area. From Qasr al-Shuwayrif, one pipeline pumps water to Tarhuna in the Nafusa Plateau region, from where it flows by gravity to the Al-Jafara Plain. Another pipeline goes north and east to the coast, where it turns west, supplying cities like Musarata and Al-Qums, and eventually ends in Tripoli. The design capacity of the system is 660 million gallons of water per day, although only a small portion of this water is needed for drinking. And finally, the third part, completed in 2009, is Phase 3. It was split into two sections and included a total of 745 miles of pipelines. The first section serves as an extension of GMR-1 and includes 434 miles of new pipelines and pump stations to increase the overall daily capacity to 972 million gallons. The second section provided an additional 36 million gallons per day to Tobruk, a city in the northeastern part of the country. The water came from wells in the Al Jagbub oasis and required the construction of a reservoir south of the city, along with another 300 miles of pipelines. The project's budget, it's claimed, is between $20 and $25 billion, though the exact cost is unclear. At one point, the Great Man-Made River Authority stated that the total expenses had been exaggerated, but this wasn't confirmed. We still know the approximate amounts, and they look like this. Phase 1 came to $5.53 billion, Phase 2, $8.05 billion, Phase 3, $6 billion. It's indeed pricey, but when you compare it to desalination, the cost is almost ridiculous. The price of this water is roughly 1/10 of desalinated. Even if the total project cost was $30 billion, as some sources claim, it's still way less than what desalination would have cost. Plus, Libya managed to avoid international borrowing, which would have only been available at ridiculously high interest rates. However, the process didn't end with the third phase. It's known that the project also includes 2 additional phases, the 4th and 5th, which also involve expanding the GMR-1 system. In the end, the total capacity of the Great Man-Made River, considering all the completed stages, should be about 1.7 billion gallons of water per day. As I mentioned, the full network will include about 2,500 miles of pipelines. Yeah, the 3rd and 4th phases are still unfinished. The construction got delayed because of the military actions. International companies still haven't been able to resume work on the project because of ongoing security issues. The majority of the remaining work has to do with connections, which will bring the water to more distant regions deep in the country. No new wells are planned, and there won't be any new large pipes added. The main river channel is already finished, though the construction process was far from easy. When Muammar Gaddafi decided to launch the project in 1983, it wasn't exactly the best time. Libya's international relations were in decline, the country was under U.S. sanctions, including a ban on exporting certain technologies and a ban on oil exports, the main source of Libya's income. Libya couldn't even get help from private American contractors. Although the project was meant to prevent water shortages, the development of the Great Man-Made River was overshadowed by the president's political decisions. The Great Man-Made River held a unique position in Libya under Gaddafi, but lost it after the regime fell in 2011. Then came the Civil War. The Great Man-Made River managed to distance itself from the country's political upheavals by emphasizing its role as a service provider, but that still didn't save the project from attacks and acts of vandalism. Political instability in Libya since 2011 has affected nearly every sector and aspect of society. The unstable economic situation has impacted many government institutions, and the Great Man-Made River was no exception. The lack of stable electricity, constant security breaches of the river's infrastructure, and attacks on staff have only made the existing problems worse. The factory that made the pipes for the Great Man-Made River was destroyed by an airstrike. Many sections of the river became unusable, and by 2019, 101 wells out of 479 had been dismantled. All of them were part of the Western Pipeline System. Even worse, the Great Man-Made River was occasionally used as a weapon against specific regions of the country. One side would block the water supply to areas held by the other side. So, what's going on with the Great Man-Made River today? Back in 2017, it was reported that the project supplies 660 million gallons of water daily, although the total amount varies depending on what's happening in the country. In the post-Gaddafi era, the Great Man-Made River has been operating with 2 of the 4 original planned phases, highlighting its aim to supply water regardless of the political and economic situation in Libya. But what happened is probably what we should have expected. According to the Atlantic Council, that's an American think tank, the lack of a comprehensive water policy or plan led to Libya facing a serious water shortage. This potentially jeopardized the river's ability to supply water to the population. In the end, the mega project failed to save Libyans from the water shortage, despite the fact that huge amounts of water are located within the country. By the way, how much water is there really? Well, some Libyan officials, referring to the size of the underground reservoirs, claim that the water supplies could keep providing water for thousands of years. However, critics argue that such statements are highly exaggerated. Some are even convinced that the Great Man-Made River won't last until the end of the 21st century. It's simple. The aquifer is very ancient, meaning it's not replenished, and the water reserves will eventually run out, And when that happens, the region will face a severe water shortage unless proper desalination infrastructure is created. But even considering that it's a non-renewable finite water supply, the country still relies on the great man-made river, even though Libya's political and economic instability has already pointed out the project's vulnerability. The river's under constant threat, so many experts agree that Libya needs to develop alternative ways of managing groundwater resources and explore other ways of using water resources. Yes, we're talking about desalination again. On the other hand, research shows that desalination is actually not a cost-effective option, given the amount of money already spent on creating the waterway. This is only possible under the most optimistic cost scenarios for desalination plants, and even then only for a limited range of water needs. So it might be possible to go in this direction if affordable plants can be created and the water produced is used, for example, only for drinking or only for agriculture. The main issue with desalination plants is that they use a lot of electricity. However, Libya has an advantage here. The country's rich and endless solar energy from the Sahara. Scientists and government experts say that covering less than 1% of the world's deserts with concentrated solar power plants could generate 100% of the electricity consumed globally. So in theory, it'd be possible to install some solar panels and eventually get enough energy for desalination, but as usual, it's easier said than done, because such an initiative requires funding. And of course, safety guarantees. The biggest news in the past few days is that I changed the bed linens. I bought new ones. Final phase. We talked a lot today about the Libyan water project, but I had a logical question. When will it be finished? The answer to that came just recently. In December 2024, it was announced that after 10 months of technical research, the construction of the fifth and final phase of the project was approved, the goal of which is to connect the entire country with a mega pipeline. Right now, it's over 2,500 miles long, and water from the underground pipes provides for more than 70% of Libyan cities, but the pipes did not reach everywhere. Some northeastern regions of Libya were excluded from this large-scale plan. Looks like the last phase of construction will help improve things in that area of the country. As for the technical details, the so-called Fifth River will tap 320 wells south of Kufra, an oasis at the southern tip of Libya, and 100 more wells to the east of Sarir. The new pipelines will run about 930 miles and have a combined capacity of over 660 million gallons per day. While it may seem pretty simple, a project this size comes with its challenges. Take, for example, the fact that the pipeline will cross a variety of landscapes. The altitude will vary from 33 to 980 feet above sea level. A task like this requires a ton of research and a lot of pumps to get the water moving. There's also a need for constant funding. The project has already cost around $25 to $30 billion, and it's still unclear how much more is needed to complete the fifth phase. Plus, they need to bring in skilled staff and choose quality materials. In short, there's still a lot of work to do. Lack of water. Libya is a very dry country. As of 2023, it was among the top countries in the Middle East and North Africa that suffered the most from drought. And the situation's unlikely to improve over time. In the coming years, more than half of Libya's population will face severe water shortages. The World Resources Institute predicts that by 2040, Libya will be facing severe water stress. If the country doesn't take urgent steps to address this issue, it could get even worse. For example, desertification is a major threat to Libya as more and more land is cleared for the ever-expanding cities. Unfortunately, nothing is being done to stop the desert from spreading. The situation's made worse by the fact that the country gets very little rainfall. The rains come at the end of winter and the beginning of spring in short, heavy showers that last only a few minutes. Plus, there are no permanent rivers in Libya. Add to this the irrational use of water, outdated pipeline systems, and lack of investment, and you get a place that's just about as uninhabitable as it gets. But Libya is really trying. Take the artificial river under the desert, for example, which we've talked about a lot today. People are putting a lot of faith in it. 13,000 wells. That's no small thing. And this whole system could meet the country's water needs for the next 1,000 years. And although the artificial river project is criticized for its cost, It seems like Libya just has no other choice. Sure, desalination's another option, but like I said before, water from the massive pipeline is just cheaper. The country probably doesn't have the spare funds to develop this field, even with all the oil production. Libyan paradox. Let's quickly go over the facts we've learned about Libya today. First, most of the country is desert. Second, rain is very rare. Third, the country is currently facing a water shortage. However, there's one place where there's more water than needed. I'm talking about the city of Zliten, and it's literally flooded. This coastal town has faced a mysterious rise in groundwater. And it wasn't just the water we're all used to. Stagnant, sticky, mud-flooded houses, streets, and palm groves around Zliten also spreading a nasty smell and creating a breeding ground for mosquitoes. Because of this incident, many residents left their homes, and it's easy to understand why. Nobody wants to live in a swamp. Of course, people tried to fight it. For example, someone even rented water trucks to pump out the stagnant water and bought a bunch of sand to spread over the swampy land, but it didn't help. The farm trees, like date palms and apple trees, were still flooded. Here's another case of flooding in Libya. It happened in September 2023, and it was just catastrophic. Over 4,000 people died, and about 10,000 went missing. And no, this time it's not the groundwater to blame. It was all about the heavy rains that triggered a storm named Daniel. Besides the huge number of victims, about a quarter of the Libyan port city of Derna was destroyed by a powerful flow of water and mud. 2 dams located upstream of the city collapsed due to the pressure of the water. As a result, about 400 buildings were buried under a thick layer of mud. And on top of that, the city was hit by wind, and a very strong one at that. Backed by warm waters with a temperature of 81 degrees Fahrenheit off the Libyan coast, tropical storm winds at speeds from 43 to 50 miles per hour knocked down trees and power lines. The aftermath of the flooding is quite tragic. The disaster in Derna forced about 30,000 people to abandon their homes. Yes, many residents from the affected areas outside of Derna managed to move to other places, but it was in Derna that things were really bad. The city's road and bridge infrastructure was destroyed, making it hard for refugees, rescue teams, government agencies, and aid to move around. As a result, the first emergency aid supplies arrived with a significant delay. They came only 36 hours after the disaster started. And now the inevitable question: what caused the devastating downpour? Many meteorologists and climatologists mentioned that Storm Daniel was so powerful because of climate change. And it seems like the situation Libya finds itself in right now is unique. According to research by the World Weather Attribution Group, the amount of rainfall in the eastern part of the country is something that could only happen once every 300 to 600 years. It's a rather ironic yet sad situation. In a dry country, there's a flood, and this water can't be used for human needs. A very cruel joke from nature. You owe me a like. See you later.